Welcome to the Internet of Assets, the podcast about the not-so-distant future of finance. My name is Ryan King, Head of Business Development at Dusk Network, and every episode I dive into a specific part of finance, and we aim to do this in a maximum of 25 minutes. And in today's episode, we're thrilled to have Thibault Schrepel with us. Thibault is an Associate Professor of Law at VU Amsterdam and a faculty affiliate at Stanford University coexist Center. He's also a blockchain expert appointed to the World Economic Forum and the World Bank, and has written extensively on the intersection of blockchain and antitrust law. Thibault, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks a lot for having me.
Could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So I'm French, as you can hear. I've been living here in the Netherlands for 5 years. I moved here mainly for the purpose of teaching competition law, which is still something that I do, but I became interested in blockchain around the time I moved here. I had a few paragraphs in my PhD in 2016, and from that decided to write one, then 2, 3, 4 papers, and then a book. And, I eventually, became stuck with the subject, and it's still something that I pretty much research every day. So that's a bit of the professional side. The less professional side, if you want a fun fact, is that I was trained to become a tennis player, professional one. Mm-hmm. And obviously, the fact that we are doing this podcast today is, I think, a good proof of the fact that I failed, right? Otherwise, I will probably be preparing for Roland Garros as we speak. So if you are in Amsterdam and want to play tennis or want to talk about blockchain, send me an email, and it's always a pleasure to do any of those two.
Good practice for a podcast, because podcast is also about back and forth, right? In the same way as tennis. So perhaps, everything was leading to this moment.
Yeah, well, everything makes sense, right? So that's what I will try to explain in today's episode.
Indeed, looking forward to it. Okay, well, let's talk a little bit about that then. So you told us a little bit there about your background. And that you had a few paragraphs and then papers and books, and you've kept interested in this field of antitrust law and blockchain. But this sounds to me like a personal interest as well as a professional interest. But how does somebody even begin to get interested in that? What made you think, you know what, antitrust law, that's what I want to focus on?
Oh, antitrust. So, my mom is a psychologist, so I can talk about that for a very long time, because I spent days, trying to analyze the reasons why I wanted to study competition or antitrust. I think it comes from some interest in markets and the beauty of emergence there. And I wanted to go to law school for the sake of knowing the rules, right? So that if you know the rules, you know how to play the game and how maybe to escape them a little bit or tweak the rules. So that's why I decided to study antitrust. And my interest in blockchain was, or came from maybe a bad place, in that I just wanted to have a few paragraphs in my PhD in which I dealt with the big tech companies, thinking, well, if blockchain ever becomes something, in 2016, this wasn't so obvious to me at the time. I just want to be able to say that this was in my PhD back in the days. And from that, I got invited to the OECD to present to competition agencies, and eventually realized that when we talk about antitrust, it's antitrust, but trust in a sense of the trustees, the big corporations, right? It's not trust in a sense of, I trust you personally that you would do this and this for me. And I came to realize that blockchain is a trust machine. So we could talk about whether it is trustless or trust creating or enhancing technology. But I think that's the intersection between the two. Blockchain creates trust, supposedly get rid of the pilot in the cockpit. And if so, it means that you cannot indeed infringe antitrust law, in which for the most part, you do need a pilot, right? To be able to direct a company in a direction that is illegal. So I think those two, the technology on the one hand and the legal system on the other, when it comes to antitrust, are actually trying to achieve the very same objective, which is to free ecosystems, and here economic ecosystems, from any sort of coercion, right? So then, of course, there are limitations, but that's a common objective. And that's why I think those two, antitrust and blockchain, should be working together, as opposed to doing what we do as lawyers, and this is what I started doing when writing my first papers, which is to only tackle the issues, right? And again, this is something I like to say to some of my students. I say, well, if you go to law school, I won't arrive one day in a classroom and say, well, today we were going to study when everything goes according to the plan and when there is no legal issues, right? This is not where you can provide value to society. But in fact, I think that it might be something that as lawyers, you want to take into consideration. Why is that? Because when there is a problem, you want to address the problem, but potentially maintain the good coming out of the technology or an ecosystems. And I'm sometimes worried that in antitrust, we might address some of those challenges in a way that will destroy or reduce the utility of technologies and here blockchain. So we need to think about the positive use cases and keep that in mind at all time.
Indeed. Okay, very clear. Let's take it back a little to basics, I suppose, in that sense. And to somebody, I mean, trust is a word which is tricky. It has a sort of psychological meaning. We have an instinctive feeling, an emotional feeling about what it means to trust somebody or trust something. But then there's a very clear, specific legal definition of what trust means in different situations. So to someone who is not familiar with how these words are used in a legal context, what is antitrust exactly? What's antitrust law?
Sure. So again, antitrust means trust in a sense of the trustees, and the trustees are the big corporations such as created in the United States. Standard Oil was one of them, and eventually a US Senator, John Sherman, came up with the idea for different reasons. He was running as a president, then failed to be elected, and eventually passed these legislations in 1990. And the idea there was indeed not to get rid of economic power and to necessarily downscale the size of the big corporations, but at least to control those corporations in the sense that they should be, of course, able to put out a product or service on the market, but they should do that in fair terms. And so antitrust came out of this idea that it's okay for you to be a big corporation, it's okay for you to offer products and services, but if you do so, we may want to maintain the possibility for other corporations and other entities to enter the market and compete with you. And so, to be very concrete, there are two main types of practices that are prohibited under antitrust laws all across the world, in more than 150 countries. Those are pretty much the same everywhere. On the one hand, you do have collusions. Here, I mean at least two entities coming together to agree on how to behave on the market. A typical example are two companies agreeing on the price of a product and not to compete and reduce prices. The other type of practice that is prohibited are the monopolization practices, or as we call them in Europe, abuses of dominance. Here, you only have one company that is so powerful that the company can indeed eliminate competition by implementing a bunch of practices. An example would be, I'm so powerful because I control the operating system that I can force you to also acquire some other softwares, which means that if you are in the business of providing softwares, it becomes much harder for you to access to customers, because by default they already have a software. So why would they get another one, right? So this is the type of practice that are or could be prohibited.
Right. So people will remember famous cases involving Microsoft, for example, as a fairly good examples of that being used.
Yeah, that's one. So indeed, and there are two versions of that. In the US in 2001, the Department of Justice came after Microsoft for tying the operating system and Internet Explorer. And we have a EU side of this case, but here we tackled, or the European Commission tackled, the tying of the operating system with Windows Media Player, right? And you could see the limitation of the case already. The European Commission was under the impression that Windows Media Player will stay there forever because it was offered by default, when in fact, just a couple of years after the case, well, no one, I suppose, was ever using Windows Media Player ever again, right? So those cases are very hard and complex, and to understand what's at stake and how to address and how to come up with a legal solution, you do need to understand first the economics behind and also the technical characteristics of the product that you are trying to tackle, which is exactly what you have in blockchain, right? If you only look at the tech and regulate the tech without understanding the economic impact, that's the recipe for a big mess. So something we should not try even at home.
Okay, well, let's talk about that a little bit more. So, like you say, if you regulate the tech, which is actually what we spend quite a bit of time on this podcast talking about with things like MiCA and its interaction with MiFID 2 and AMLD and things like that. So the regulation of the tech is very much ongoing. You're saying we need to also take into consideration, regulators need to take into consideration the regulation of the business itself. Can you elaborate a little bit more on the kinds of things they should be thinking about, or some issues that you see that maybe are not being addressed?
Sure. So, that's something that is, I wouldn't say absolutely unique to blockchain, but pretty unique in a sense of the willingness that we have in Europe to regulate the actual technology of blockchain is, when the technology is so young, right, is something that I do not witness when it comes to other technologies. I give you an example. The European Parliament just voted the final draft of the AI Act, so Artificial Intelligence Act, in which there are no discussions regarding the type of training that you may want to implement when it comes to machine learning, right? So regardless of whether your AI system is a expert system or supervised learning, deep learning, it's all the same. It's all being considered as being AI. And then the European Commission and the Parliament are regulating the use cases of AI. Now, I think they should. It can be improved by looking at the functioning of AI, but this is not what those policymakers are doing. As opposed to what we see in blockchain, we've seen failed initiatives to regulate the consensus of blockchain, but I'm pretty convinced, if you want, we can bet that in 10 years from now, the type of mechanisms to validate transactions will be regulated by the European Parliament. I'm pretty convinced that proof of work will somehow be, if not entirely banned, but at least incentivized not to be used, and so on and so forth. MiCA, MiFID 2, all of those regulations are indeed not only trying to regulate the ecosystem and the business aspects of blockchain, but also the functioning of the actual technology, which is something that worries me for a very simple reason. Looking at that from a Darwinian perspective, what you see is that at first, the different species of a technology compete with each other, right? And this is what we see, I would argue, now with blockchain. You have permission blockchain, public permissionless, public permissions, private blockchains. They all compete. And it's hard to say which one will emerge out of that competition, right? I mean, I have a personal opinion on that, but I can't tell you. I know for a fact that private blockchain won't exist in 5 years from now. And yet we are, and by we, I mean the policymakers and the regulators, interfering in the process and making choices and not letting the technology develop as it should. The problem doing that is that if you choose one technology that is inferior for certain use cases compared to what it could have been with a proper competition without regulation, the day that technology will compete with other technologies, you may see that it won't be good enough to survive. So it's hard for the policymakers sometimes to conceive, because let's say you prohibit proof of work or proof of stake. It's unlikely that all blockchain will disappear in just one day. But over time, this may create a long-lasting effect and reduce the willingness for someone to use blockchain to develop, to join the ecosystem, and therefore will benefit the big banks, right? For example. But it's hard to precisely compute the effect of your regulation, and yet I'm afraid this is something we should try to at least take into consideration. So again, the survival of the technology, or to put it differently, having pro-innovation regulation, I think should be a number one priority for EU policymakers and elsewhere as well, by the way.
The pro-innovation legislation, I like that. Yes, I suppose I can also see some what pops into my mind is some of the maybe the more consumer facing levels, like the standardization of power sockets, right? Where I see a similar thing. There's no real consideration taken for the fact that different companies are proposing different standards, because not just because they want a business edge, but also because they genuinely think this technology is better. And by forcing everyone to use the same standard, you're removing the ability for them to play around with new ideas, which of course
Yeah.
companies like Apple famously do all the time, is trying out new things and seeing what sticks, abandoning what doesn't, right?
Yeah, exactly. And it is not to say that we shouldn't somehow regulate how many times you can change, let's say, the charger, the cables, or this, or whether or not you should announce month before that you will change it so that competitors have the time to develop something compatible. But indeed, what we have now in Europe is that you have to use USB-C,
Yeah.
which means that the willingness to come up with a USB-E or F or X is gone. So they would say that every 5 years or so they will come together and revise the standard. But for 5 years, for a fact that if you come up with a better alternative, you can't actually use that in your smartphone, and you have to trust the policymakers for making the right choice in a couple of years and implementing the best standards, at that time. So this, again, coming from a Darwinian perspective, is actually the type of regulation that is killing competition, that is killing the survival of the fittest idea, and potentially, I think, not putting us where we want to be when it comes to competing with China and the United States and other continents.
Indeed. Yeah, that's an excellent point. And yeah, so in that sense, I just have a slight segue, because you actually touched upon this in one of your answers. So when we were seeing the final drafts of MICA coming along, I think a lot of people predicted that there was going to be a flat out proof of work ban as part of MICA. And then when it was passed, it was nowhere to be seen except some hints that it was being thought about. Were you surprised it didn't come through? And follow on question, do you expect to see something like this maybe in MICA 2 or some future redraft?
I wasn't surprised. I knew that some members of the European Parliament wanted to go that way, but that they didn't have any support there. And the same, by the way, we've seen in the United States, right? It has been, and I forgot the name of those senators, put on the table that proof of work should be banned. I wasn't surprised. Now, that being said, are we about to see some technical standards or ban being implemented in the coming month and years? I would say yes, absolutely. So this is where, again, I'm worried that we won't make the right choices. And it is not to say that we shouldn't try to harmonize and to come up with more compatibilities in the entire ecosystem. I actually wrote a paper on that with Vitalik back a few years ago, where we pretty much explained that the law has a very important role to play. But to quote a great economist, Jean Tirole, actually, who is a Nobel laureate, what he said is that standards become a good idea once the industry actually came up with the one solution that is acceptable to everyone out there. But what you do not want to do is, at the early stages of technology, decide a top-down standard based on a few meetings that you may have with some players in the ecosystem. So standards, when it comes to the consensus, I think are far away from us now. Of course, you may always have a bad surprise. In the next 10 years, yes, I wouldn't be too surprised if proof of work was to be prohibited, at least in Europe. But this is not all there is, right? So in MiCA and MiFID II, you see that here and there are incentives being created to design blockchain certain ways. I would say that this is, again, not what we want.
Yeah, indeed. A lot of excellent points there, including, as you said there, the concept, even the concept of those few meetings the regulators have had. Who have you met with? It's going to shape very, very differently your perspectives when you come out of the meeting, because, of course, any company can make a very strong logical sounding case that their technology is the way to go, and it's the only obvious way that this whole thing can be built, right? And then you
Yeah.
can come out of that meeting, of course, accidentally with the same opinion based on who took your call, I mean, think about it, who you have an email address for, or who can be bothered to come to Brussels and have a meeting. You can have massive impact for the whole industry. I think it's a really, really interesting point. Um,
And
so
on that, if I may, I'm not complaining because I never got invited to the European Commission or the European Parliament. Being a
no, no,
professor of law in Europe, right, I get that access, and I enjoyed that very much. But I think more people should get this type of access when they do consultations and people send contributions. I would love to see a note explaining what they got, and the tendencies in all of those contributions that they received. And quite a few months ago, it was proposed that the agenda of the members of the European Parliament should be become public to some degree, or at least that the meetings they have with the companies and individuals should be publicized. And this was rejected. And I see no reasons why those members who are elected by us should be in a situation, except for security and cybersecurity reasons, sure, but other than that, why can't we access their agenda and see who they encounter and try to compute how this influence the type of legislations they come up with? So maybe something to reintroduce in the coming month.
Well, it's a standard, right? You're an academic. When you write a paper, you don't just put data and information in there and then not source it, right? You can't just say, oh, yeah, it's just something it's just what I know, right? You put your sources down, you put your references down, you do a bibliography, right? You show your work, you show your evidence, and that's what we should expect from our regulators too, I think.
That's a very profound point, because the academics, we are peer reviewed. And if you do
Yes.
publish in a place that is not peer reviewed, it's pretty much worth nothing for my academic development. Now, the policymakers, to some degree, can make a point, are peer reviewed because they have some elections. But of course, if you vote 2,000 different rules and standards over the term, maybe people will peer review what you've done based on one or two that are very easy to conceive, but certainly not the entirety of your track record. So that leads me to actually something that I proposed in a paper a few weeks ago, which is something that I called proof of vigilance. And the idea there will be to say, okay, you want to pass a new legislation, let's say to regulate blockchain because you want to reduce carbon emission, right? Or the impact it has on the environment. I know that's a big one. Sure. Okay. Now you explain to me what is precisely the objective. That's one. Two, how will you compute whether or not your legislation can achieve that objective? So don't just tell me I want to reduce the impact blockchain has in the environment, but tell me precisely how you will measure whether or not your regulation is effective. Three, make the data public, right? So you will put certainly some sensors to try to document whether or not you are effective. Make that public so that with researchers and the industry can also assess the quality of your data. And 4 or 5, then explain to me what are the threshold and the mechanisms that you will put in place to potentially lower your regulation, get rid of your regulation if it doesn't work, or maybe deepen the enforcement aspect of your regulation. And if you do all that, then I will be indeed convinced that you are peer reviewed by what's happening in reality. And I would say that the policymakers, they have a lot to gain in doing that, right? Because if indeed their rules and standards are effective, at least that's easy for them to defend and potentially to introduce a new one in the future because they have some good track record there. So I think eventually we're going to have to come up with this sort of mechanisms to make the role and the actions of the policymakers more transparent and accountable to all of us.
Yeah. Well, I can just say that not only in blockchain, but peer review of government policy is something I would like to see everywhere. This is a fantastic idea. All right, let's just jump into the unpopular opinion. Thibault, what's an unpopular opinion that you have about the current blockchain space?
Sure, I will answer your question, but first let me ask you a question. Did you ever have a guest with 2 unpopular opinions on a podcast?
Not that they've said out loud, but if you're going to say them out loud, you shall be a pioneer.
All right, sounds good. Okay, number one, I would say that most blockchains are not decentralized. By the way, there are some initiatives being developed as I speak to try to come up with a ratio to measure decentralization, which is something we need. But the reason why I'm saying that is because I think most of the definitions that we have of decentralizations are wrong. Most people would define that as the ability to act freely, right? Or not being coerced by somebody or someone else. And the definition I would use actually, which is something that is very deep embedded into the rules and standards, especially in France, is the ability to be part of an ecosystem where you can not act freely, but decide for yourself where you can act freely. So I'll give you an example. If you're part of a state that tells you that as a parent, you can decide for yourself the type of education you want to give your kids and the type of health that you want to give your kid and so on and so forth, then you are part of a decentralized ecosystem because you have those zones of freedom, education and health, and there you will make a decision, well, I want to educate my kid this way or that way. Now, for most of the blockchain, what you see is that people may have the freedom, let's say the core developers, the miners, they may have the freedom to code the software one way, to validate some transactions or not, but they do not have the freedom to choose all other zones of actions where they may choose for themselves whether or not they want to do something. So that's, in popular opinion, number one. Most blockchains are not decentralized. The second one I would say is I know that code is law, and I would agree with that, meaning that the way by which you design your ecosystem will actually trigger some behaviors, specific behaviors. But I would say that it is highly insufficient. And I know this is not super popular to hear, that you do need the rules and standards, and that even though you may be a crypto anarchist, you have to rely on the government. And I give you just one example, and that ties to my work on antitrust. You may code your blockchain all you want. If you do need to advertise your new product to get new users, and if for the purpose of being attractive, you do need to use the big tech companies' advertisement platforms, let's say Google, Amazon, Facebook, and so on and so forth, again, all you can do is hope for the best, that they will give you access to their platform. And the code of your actual product has nothing to do when it comes to their willingness to give you that access, right? And this is where you may need antitrust, because if they refuse to give you access, you may have a case in saying that there is a refusal to deal. So this idea that code is law is true, but I would say code is law and insufficient. And what you need is actually those rules and standards, even though you may have a strong dislike for the government and the legal institution. I suppose not too popular. And I would expect a few emails from listeners, but please feel free to engage.
So there you have it. Not one, but two, not unpopular, but deeply unpopular opinions. Let's go back into this issue of the intersection of antitrust law and blockchain, and talk about some specific regulatory issues that you think need to be addressed sooner rather than later.
Sure. So I will start from a space that I've been investigating in recent weeks, and that I already mentioned quite a few times. That is the idea that, sure, the rules and standards can be used against you, right? So let's say you finance some terrorism and we find out about it and you used some crypto. Well, yeah, the law here will be against you, right? But it could also be used in a way that is not only friendly, but necessary for your ecosystem to develop. And I'll give you an example when it comes to the relationship between the big tech companies and Web3, right? Or the crypto economy. What you see is that for most, if not all, as I speak in 2023 of the crypto projects to develop, you would need access to two different types of infrastructure. The first one is, or are the infrastructures that are necessary for your product to function. Here, have in mind access to cloud solutions. We see that pretty much 50% of some of the big blockchains are stored on AWS. That's Amazon, right? That's also the computational power. It might be also that you do need access to some sort of hardware, right? If you want to provide a contactless payment solution, let's say a Web3 one, if you do not have access to the NFC antenna of the smartphone manufacturer, then that's it. You can't just, bypass that and make it work contactless. So the adoption will decrease there, and so on and so forth. It might be that for people to be able to buy NFTs, you need to have access to the API of Apple for the company not to take 30% of all of the sales, and so on and so forth. So that's one. You need access to the big tech company's infrastructure for you to function. The second one is what I alluded to already, access to their infrastructures when it comes to adoption. And here I do have in mind the use cases. For instance, Minecraft, a game owned by Microsoft, banned the NFTs a year ago, right? So this will decrease the adoption. Facebook announced that in their virtual world Horizon, you would have been able to use your own NFT, and then eventually they a few weeks ago decided not to pursue this idea. But this would have increased, whether or not we like it, the value of your NFT, because you could do something more with it than just having that on a wallet. The ability to advertise on YouTube. We know that this company, again here Google, has a history of prohibiting blockchain Web3 based accounts and then apologizing in public and reinstating those public channels. So you see that there is a tendency here for anti-competitive practices, and so on and so forth, right? So you do need access to those. It might be that the blockchain ecosystem will be strong enough in, let's say, 5 to 10 years so that you don't even need access to the Web2 infrastructure. But as I speak, I think you do. And in fact, just ask yourself this question. Have you ever seen a Web3 project without a Twitter account? I'm sure there are some examples of that, but this is very rare, right? And so this is where antitrust has a very important role to play. And I am working with competition agencies in trying to foster this type of mindset, which is something that is not usual for a lawyer, where you are indeed raised as a lawyer to use the law in a confrontational way. This is most of what we do when it comes to the big tech companies, the Web2, right? They do not pursue the same objective as the policymakers most of the time, and therefore this creates, some sort of tensions. When it comes to blockchain and Web3, I think most of what the ecosystem is trying to achieve is actually going in a direction that the antitrust agencies are also pursuing, meaning improving consumer welfare, getting rid of centralized zone of controls, decentralizing the economy, and so on and so forth. And so we need to have not only a confrontational mindset, but also a cooperative one. So that will be a very concrete example of where I think antitrust has a very important role to play, which means that, of course, I'm not asking all of you to go to law school and take, very specialized training in competition law. But if you are just aware of the type of practices or things that may be implemented against you, send an email to your national competition agencies. There is such an agency in every country in the world, and do explain, what's happening to you, and the agency will investigate. Worst case scenario, nothing will happen. Best case scenario, well, the agency will undertake action against the company that is trying to destroy your business, right? So have this mindset again of using the law as something that may help the development of your business.
Great. That's fantastic to have some advice for people out there, because I think a lot of people may be working on these projects. Some of these teams are quite small, one or two developers, and may not have even occurred to them because it seems so obvious sometimes. Like, yeah, of course a company can set a policy and say we don't advertise Web3 services. Of course they can do that. It's their right. But as you well pointed out, we have antitrust and competition laws for exactly the purpose to stop this happening. So that's a fantastic bit of advice.
And on that, I'm also working on the project entitled Computational Antitrust, in which I'm trying to to foster the use of AI and blockchain within the competition agencies. We have 65 of those competition agencies. I can tell you that literally all of them will be answering your emails. So you don't even have to send a proper complaint, right? It's not as going to the police. You go on their websites, all of them have a section where they say something's happening to you, just send us an email and start engaging with them. And at least, you will increase their understanding of the technology, and they may indeed identify some sort of practices, and you may get money back, right? If you suffered from some sort of anti-competitive behaviors, and at the very least, the practice being stopped, which may help you. So feel free to engage and actually do so if you have any questions, because they will come back to you in a matter of days.
And that's great because, at least in my mind, that loops back into what you said earlier. We mentioned about the need for regulators to have these conversations, these people that they can call, these resources that they can draw on when they're putting this legislation together. And of course, if there is a stack of interaction sitting in a file somewhere between Web3 companies and competition boards, then that helps, doesn't it, to build that understanding, to build that evidence, and give them the kind of background and confidence they need to write this legislation properly in the future.
Yeah, indeed. And if you are concerned about the fact that they may, because of your email, be aware that you exist and therefore undertake action against you, just think about how bad this would be for the agency in terms of signaling, right? This would be the end of the agency receiving emails from companies and complaints, because if they do so and start doing it with you, and you publicize that, that's pretty much the end of it. And the agency will be in a position where all they could do then would be to be proactive and identify practices themselves, which they don't have the budget for, right? 90% of all the cases are cases based on some sort of emails or complaints that they receive, which is very precious to them. So do not be worried that the agency will start investigating your business because of your email. This is, at the very least, extremely unlikely to happen.
Yeah, and it's not really their purview, is it? As you said, these agencies have very strict remits of what they're supposed to investigate, what they're supposed to spend their limited time and resources on. And to me, this doesn't sound like what they're supposed to be doing.
No, indeed.
Okay, let's move past these issues that we're looking at the moment, and let's assume for a second that these can be resolved, either in a good way or a bad way, depending how we want to look at it. How do you see the future of finance, say we're looking maybe 5-10 years from now, and what role does blockchain and other technologies that you've mentioned have in shaping what that future looks like?
I would see, but again, I'm biased. Going back to your very first question, why am I interested in competition law and the psychological reasons behind? I would see a competing space in which the big banks, the Web2 companies do exist. I am not of the opinion that maybe a third one, that the DAOs will take over any form of existing corporations for, transaction cost-based reasons. But I will also see that there is indeed a space for blockchain to exist and for DeFi to provide something to users, but only if DeFi retains what differentiates itself from what exists already. So, and I know this is hard, and I'm aware that, you may have to consider balances between decentralization on the one hand and the willingness to be more efficient on the other and to move quickly and impose decisions, kind of the Steve Jobs mindset where you can actually anticipate what people want. You can only do so, or actually you can easily do so if you are fully centralized. But if you go in this direction, the day you will start competing for real with, let's say, the big banks, why would people use your centralized Web3 DeFi application as opposed to the one of a big bank? I see no reason why, except for, a bunch of users for ideological reasons. But for when it comes to scale, I see no reason why they would do so. So I would say the only way to survive is to be decentralized in a way that I've defined. And it may be that it is harder to scale because of that. But yet on the long run, I would say absolutely central. And some I know will go in this direction and will, I would say, coexist with centralized live forms of finance and Web3, generally speaking.
Indeed. So keep your spirit, keep what makes you unique. Indeed. That's a great piece of advice, and that actually brings into the last question, which is exactly what I was going to ask. I would say that would be the main, in my opinion, that sounds like that would be the main takeaway from yourself to individuals and companies that are so looking to stay ahead of the curve in this rapidly evolving landscape. But perhaps one or two other pieces of advice that you might recommend from your unique perspective.
To stay ahead of the curve.
Indeed.
Um, yeah, that's a tough one. I would say do not obsess over what your competitors are doing. I would say, and if you look at management literature and empirical studies, this is a recipe for failure. Do obsess about your own customers and your own vision of what success might be. But again, certainly not changing your behaviors just because one of your competitors introduced a new feature, and therefore, you may feel forced to do so in order to compete. But I would say don't do that. So, and again, that doesn't mean that you should not be aware of your environment, aware that you have competitors. If you don't have any competitors, by the way, this might not be so good, right? Because if you have such a great idea, why would you be the only one? So you will have most likely competitors. They will do stuff against you. But if you only adjust to what they do without a vision, I think you won't make it. So again, stay unique. I think you summarized that pretty well.
Thank you. Okay, so we've had a great conversation today with Thibault Schrepel, and we talked about the need for regulators to take into account the business case as well as the technology case when coming up with regulations, the importance of understanding where these regulations come from in terms of what conversations the regulators have had with which companies building which technology, the need for Web3 companies to be able to get and to some extent demand access to services currently held by companies that are mostly could be defined as Web 2, the usefulness and importance to your business of reaching out to antitrust agencies and contacting them about issues that you find when you're trying to promote your business, and how that itself can contribute back to the general understanding that regulators have about the business. And finally, Thibault recommended strongly that do not obsess over what your competitors are doing, obsess over what you're doing, and make that unique value proposition that you have the core to moving your business forward in the future. Thank you so much, Thibault. I've really enjoyed having the conversation with you today. My name's Ryan King. This was the Internet of Assets, the podcast about the not so distant future of finance. And thanks to everyone for listening.